My name is Patrick Correra. I'd like to present on the topic Introduction to Lease Accounting according to IFRS 16 on leases. The presentation outline will be in this manner. I'll start by the learning outcomes, definition of terms, and then how to account for lease transactions from the perspective of the lessee. Upon completion of this topic, you will be able to account for right-of-use assets and lease liabilities in the books of the lessee. Also, explain the exemption from the recognition criteria for the lessee, for leases in the records of the lessee. Finally, explain the impact of current events on lease accounting. What is a lease agreement? IFRS 16 gives us the definition. A lease is a contract that conveys the right to use an underlying asset for a period of time in exchange for consideration. There are two parties involved in a lease agreement. The lessor is the entity that provides the right to use an underlying asset in exchange for consideration. The lessee is the entity that obtains the right to use an underlying asset in exchange for consideration. How do we account for lease transactions in the books of the lessee? IFRS 16 gives us the guidance. At the commencement of the lease, the lessee should recognize the right-of-use asset and the lease liability. We don't classify leases anymore. In other words, the default treatment is to capitalize the lease. However, there are few recognition exemptions. Where we are dealing with short-term leases, in other words, 12 months or less lease agreements. Also, where we're dealing with leases where the underlying asset is of low value. The accounting standard allows us to account for the lease transactions under this category in a simplified way. There are several key journal entries that we should pass when recording lease transactions in the books of the lessee. I shall explain in detail the various accounts that are affected when we're dealing with lease transactions in the books of the lessee in the following slides. Lease liability account. What comprises the lease liability? IFRS 16 gives us the guidance. We should recognize lease liability at present value of payments not yet made, and these payments include any fixed payments according to the lease agreement, amounts expected to be paid under residual value guarantees, options to purchase that are reasonably certain to be exercised, termination penalties if the lease term reflects expectation that these will be incurred. IFRS 16 says we should recognize right-of-use asset at cost, which is equal to initial value of lease liability, payments made at or before commencement, initial direct cost, estimated cost of asset removal or dismantling as per lease conditions. To calculate the lease liability and the right-of-use asset, entities must establish the length of the lease term. According to IFRS 16, the lease term comprises Non-cancelable periods, periods covered by an option to extend the lease if reasonably certain that this option will be exercised. Periods covered by an option to terminate the lease if reasonably certain that this option will not be exercised. According to IFRS 16, we treat lease transactions in the books of the lessee after the commencement date in this way. Lease liability account, we should take note that the lease liability is increased by the interest charge, which is also recorded in the statement of profit or loss, as shown in the above journal entry illustration. Right of use asset, according to IFRS 16, unless another model is chosen, the cost model is used. In other words, the asset will be measured at cost, less accumulated depreciation, and any impairment losses. Depreciation account. According to IFRS 16, the asset should be depreciated. And the standard also gives us the guidance as to how we depreciate this asset. If ownership transfers to the lessee at the end of the lease, we should depreciate asset over the remaining useful life of the asset. If ownership does not transfer to the lessee at the end of the lease, we should depreciate the asset over the shorter of the lease term and the useful life of the asset. I would like to end this presentation by probably throwing to the students some research work for them probably to probe and investigate the implications on lease accounting due to COVID-19 pandemic, and also the sanctions on Russia for its attempted invasion of Ukraine. I believe this will be of interest for both learners and educators, as well as standard setters going forward, because the current events have had a significant impact on lease accounting. Well, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.